Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you. So, number three lecture in our series of three for this week, and we are wrapping it up with World War II. So, um, World War One, Russian Revolution, World War II. How are they all related? Well, over the period of that 40 years, basically, if we look at from 1900 all the way up until 1945 with the end of World War II, there are a series of events that basically contribute to each other. So, how one informs the other. And so, what we're going to look at is World War II, and where we're going to start is what were some of the contributing factors that led to World War II. Now, I'm not going to be able to get into all the details. This isn't a course where we, understand, the specific events that were going on in Germany or the specific events that were going on in Japan. I will probably make reference to various aspects as I'm speaking, but I really just want you to think of like, once again, the total, impact of this war, because this yet again is another extremely devastating war on not just the continent of Europe, but on the continent of Asia. And this is something that is global. There's well over, 30 countries that are involved in it. And so this is something that, to be able to critique it because it too not only influences the direction that our country takes in the post-war period, but that other countries in the world takes in the post-war period. So let's go ahead and let's get straight into it. So we're going to look at the causes. We're going to look at the alliances. Definitely look at some of the key events. Not going to go into a huge amount of detail, but I will highlight some of them and point you out into some areas that you may want to investigate further, trying to understand, this global conflict, whom exactly is involved and the extent and the degree, how the war, ultimately comes to an end. I'll be mentioning that with the key military events, try to join in the two, and then of course the consequences as well. So where we ended with the World War One and the Treaty of Versailles that was signed in 1919. These harsh penalties, which essentially the Treaty of Versailles blamed Germany for everything. It's all Germany's fault. They're the ones who did it. They're the ones who have to pay. And it creates, not just a financial hardship, they lose territory, they lose resources, they lose, their colonies, they have extreme military restrictions, right? And so there's a huge amount of resentment that develops. There's economic instability, there's social anxiety, there is a desire to want to get back at those people who have put us into these economic conditions, this malaise, so to speak. And so, this is one of the major foundations of what leads to World War II. It is the conditions that come about as a consequence of the Treaty of Versailles. And so, to say that the Treaty of Versailles is responsible for everything, no, but it is certainly a bedrock, a foundation for what was to come literally, 20 years later with the invasion of Poland. So, you have the Treaty of Versailles. Now, that anxiety that's created because of the poor economic conditions, because of the loss of standing, loss of respect, it creates an environment where the people themselves are looking for an answer, looking for some reason to take that angst, that anger, that resentment out on somebody, right? And if there's in these environments where people have, an unstable economy, they're not sure about their future, they don't see any real prospects, it's very easy to become manipulated and conditioned into following a person or people that you don't necessarily truly understand what they may be capable of. This is one of the reasons why Hitler is able to come to power in the 1930s. Now, Hitler had, some sort of had some influence in Germany, in the late 1920s, before, actually rebranding himself and rebranding his party as something that could be trusted and supported and actually was, considered legitimate as an actual political party. But, Hitler and the fascist ideas that he was promoting were actually a result of what was going on in Russia. When the Russian Revolution takes place, as was mentioned in the previous lecture, and the Bolsheviks and their communist ideas, are become the center organizing principle for the government that is established in the Soviet Union. This is one of the reasons why fascism is a response to that, because fascism strongly distrusts communism, right? Fascism does not believe in these ideas of these principles that, there should be some sort of centralized, authority governing all aspects of a country. In terms of these notions. And so Hitler and his fascism are catalyzed through that economic depression. They are catalyzed through into totalitarianism because of the events that are happening in Europe and because of what happens in Versailles. Now, it's important to understand that when, Hitler wrote down some of his ideas when he was in prison, when he tried to create the first coup attempt in the 1920s in Germany. When he was thrown into prison and he's writing Mein Kampf, he comes up with various ideas in terms of how exactly he's going to reassert himself. And the first thing that he realizes is that he has to get the military behind him. He has to create a legitimacy in terms of a party platform. He has to be able to win the hearts and minds of the people. He can't just be some sort of fringe element like he was at the time and be able to think that people are just going to follow him. And so when Hitler is rising to power, when he's actually able, to get, when the party of the Nazis is able to, win elections, win positions of power, being able to create greater strength, in the parliament, then what ends up happening is that as that assertion and that power and that authority becomes more solidified. And Hitler begins to start to look outward in terms of the ideas that he laid in Mein Kampf to be able to take over various regions of Europe. The response from European leaders is, well, if we give this to him, if we allow Hitler to go into the Rhineland, if we allow Hitler to annex Austria, if we allow Hitler to go into Czechoslovakia, we will just appease the desires of whatever he wants and it won't go any further. This is what is known as the appeasement policy. And it was pushed by people like by Neville Chamberlain, the prime minister in England at the time. Who actually admired Hitler. He thought that what he saw that was going on in Germany, especially in the 1930s, was good, right? This is a group of people that are, seem to have their self-respect back. The economy is doing better. They're behind a leader, right? Things seem to be good. And he wanted peace, right? England and much of Europe still remember the Great War. People who, children who were born in 1919 were just old enough now to join in to the next Great War here in the 1930s. So if you think about it, it's like, literally, it's not even one generation of people that are going to have to experience another war. So the idea of appeasement was really built on this idea that, we don't want to get involved in another war. We want to be able to avoid it. We believe that Germany wants peace. That's what they keep telling us. And yet, what's very fascinating about that is that the whole appeasement policy, that both France and England were willing to extend to Germany and not enforce, the Treaty of Versailles and question what was going on. One of the first things is that they didn't want to antagonize Germany, but the other thing was is that they actually didn't realize what was going on. Because of Versailles said that there was not an opportunity for Germany to rearm themselves, right? To rebuild their military, rebuild their air force, rebuild their navy, right? Because of the restrictions of Versailles. What Germany does under Hitler is actually quite clever. So instead of having, a factory that builds just tanks or builds just planes or builds some sort of weaponry, what they would do is that they would actually create factories that would actually build one part. right? One part of the tank, one part of a ship, one part of a jet engine, right? Whatever the case may be. And so this actually looked like something benign. Like it doesn't look like they're rearming at all. But then what they would do is that all these little pieces would be shipped to like one city and then they'd be assembled. And so what it would do is it would actually hide not just the intentions that the German government was actually trying to rearm itself and was actually creating an aggressive stance, but it also hides that they are actually rearming and their real intentions. And so what you have here is that in the 1930s, you know, England is one of the few places that's, begins to, think like maybe we should rearm, but those individuals are in the minority, especially Winston Churchill, who's a representative at the time. He's not in, the cabinet. He's not the prime minister yet. France too, right? Most of Europe, was still recovering from the First World War, and they had not put in money or resources to basically rearm, unlike the German government. So that's what you have going on over in that area. So then in Asia, you have Japanese expansionism. Remember, this is a period still of imperialism, right? Countries are still measured in terms of their holdings that they have. Germany had lost face in terms of an imperial power because it had to give up all of its colonial holdings after World War One. And so now you have a country like Japan that has ambitions to expand itself. Remember, it is an island and it's limited in terms of resources. And in order for it to have a growing military and a growing economy, it needs energy. And one of the first places that it begins to covet is China, particularly um, the northeast part of China, which at the time was known as Manchuria. This is an area that was rich in coal, oil, railways. And so this is one of the first areas that Japan decides to invade and sets up a colony, a puppet colony, essentially known as Manchukuo, and in 1931. And so this is actually the start of Japan's expansionary visions in terms of what it's going to do on the continent of Asia. This is, largely celebrated behind an emperor, behind a militaristic government. This is what is going to lead to their eventual full-scale invasion in 1937 in terms of mainland China and would eventually lead to the Pacific conflict, therein. Um, and so you have all of these factors. You have German rearmament, you have the resentment, you have a growing population, you have appeasement of European powers. And then finally, what ends up happening is that the Nazis get into an agreement in 1939 in terms of how to separate or how to share the country of Poland, which is in the center between Germany and the Soviet Union. And so they come up with the Nazi-Soviet Pact in 1939, and then on September 1st, 1939, Germany invades Poland, which is the start of World War II, because as soon as they invade, both uh, England decides that that's the final straw. They're going to withdraw their ambassadors from Germany and declare war. France does a few hours later. So if you take a look here in terms of the map, that basically what we're looking at in 1941. So this is 2 years after the invasion of Poland. So you can see Poland right here. Basically, it was split in half. You had the half on this side of the USSR, and then you had this side, which is going to be Germany. So this is in 1940, in 1941. What's going to end up happening, though, is that you're actually going to see that there's going to be even a further push by Germany. Germany is going to begin to invade France. It's going to move into the Soviet Union. It's going to make more of an expansion in terms of its areas here in Libya and in North Africa. Essentially, what's going to end up happening here is that you have basically a very similar situation to what was happening in World War One, where you're going to have the countries of England, Russia, eventually the United States, on one side in terms of the Allies, and then you have the Axis powers, which is going to be Germany, Italy, and Japan. But this is a worldwide conflict. Okay, so we're talking about the entire world is involved in this war. Okay, so when we take a look at the military events and we talk them about the theaters of war, so we're talking about theater in Europe, we're talking about theater in the Pacific. So we basically have a series of events in terms of from the full onslaught invasion of what happens in Poland all the way until the Battle of Berlin in 1945, where Hitler kills himself in the bunker and Nazi Germany surrenders. So essentially what you have is this, is that you have the invasion of Poland in 1939, and this is basically what is known as the Blitzkrieg, where Germany basically does it on two fronts, is they send in their planes to bomb various cities, namely the capital of Warsaw, and then they send in their tanks and then the ground troops to take over the area. Literally, the Polish forces are beaten within a matter of days. And, that's essentially it. The country is taken over, and that will be the start of the occupation and then the eventual purging of all undesirables, of course, according to Nazi eugenics theory. So, of course, this starts with the Jews. They get rid of homosexuals, they get rid of intellectuals, they get rid of gypsies, anybody who is considered not to be of pure Aryan blood or somebody that is going to be of use to the society. And so Poland, and we're not going to go into the details of it, but Poland really becomes the epicenter of really some of the worst of the Holocaust that takes place. But there are other areas as well. I mean, this isn't to say that, Poland was the only place where the Holocaust happened. The Holocaust is a broad range of areas, not just of camps, but of slaughters, of in terms of like the work that is done by the German military and by the German government. Whether it is in concentration camps or whether it is just in terms of mass annihilations and shootings, we're talking about massive destructions on a humanitarian scale that no one has ever seen before. Shortly after the invasion in Poland and moving to the east, the German government moves out to the west with the fall of France, takes Paris in a couple of days. This is and this is just an absolute, travesty. France, could not fight back. There is a Vichy government in the south, which basically joins with the, Hitler government is basically like a proxy to control this area. There is a resistance that develops in the southern part of the government as well as in the northern part of Paris against the Germans. But, for the most part, this is going to be one of the areas, the theaters of war, where there is going to be constant antagonisms. The Battle of Britain, maybe many of you have seen this, where Great Britain has to black out their lights. They basically black out their cities because the the German war machine would send these bombers to basically bomb the cities, and the whole idea was to basically bomb the island into submission where they would just give up. But this is perhaps where you've, seen, this is where, Winston Churchill, comes into his own, this idea that, we will fight in the landing grounds and fight on the shores and fight on the shops, this whole idea of getting everyone together as well as a unifying aspect where they would have, these air raid sirens that would be going off. People would go into, these shelters that are underground or into the subway tubes, but the entire country is mobilized to try to defend itself and defend its island. Unfortunately, fortunately, the German military is not able to take, hold of Britain. For one point in the war, they are the only voice in Europe that is actually actively resisting. And they will get help from the Americans in 1941, but literally from 1940 until 1941, for an entire year, they are literally on their own. So this was basically a demonstration of German air superiority, annihilation of, the British military, as a way to drag them down. But they resist and they are able to fight back and hold off, invasion of their island. But probably one of the most stunning and horrific aspects of this war is Operation Barbarossa. Operation Barbarossa was conceived by Hitler in 1940, basically at the time when he is at his zenith in terms of popularity. The German people love him. They have won battle after battle. They're in France, they're in Poland, they are in parts of Eastern Europe. Things are just going extremely well. They've taken over Austria. Like everything is great. Things are great. What could be better? And so, of course, Hitler just believes that he's completely invincible. And so he comes up with this idea to, finally invade the USSR. This is one of the main points in his book, in Mein Kampf, where he calls this breathing room. That the goal that to take over areas like, Poland and Czechoslovakia. This is just, to have extra space. The real prize is that we want to be able to take Moscow and we want to take the Soviet Union. Now, what's interesting about this is that, Hitler in 1940 actually invites one of the foreign ministers, one of the basically second or third in command below um, Comrade Stalin. His name is Molotov, and he comes to speak, to Hitler because basically, Hitler, is offering, as they did with the Poland, basically like, hey, let's start to carve up the resources of the British Empire. And Molotov is listening to this, but he's also like, well, what are the guarantees that, you're not going to invade us and all this other stuff. And this basically pisses off Hitler because Molotov looks like, he's got this guy and he's like sort of he looks like sort of like an accountant. He's got a little dingy gray suit. He's not, he's soft spoken. He looks sort of like a math teacher. Like nobody really gives a shit about him. But what's interesting about it is that he's really pushing back on Hitler and these ideas of like, oh, well, you're just gonna be able to, go wherever. Well, what the guarantees for us is the Soviet Union. So this pisses Hitler off and he basically ends the meeting. And so Molotov has to meet with another foreign minister. His name is Ribbentrop, and they actually do come up with a pact, an agreement, because they're at this dinner, and Hitler's supposed to be there, but because he was pissed off about the earlier meeting that he had with Molotov, he doesn't show up. So whatever. So they're having a meeting, and then all of a sudden there are these air raid sirens that go off because England is still sending their planes over into Germany, to try to attack back. So, they go into this air raid shelter and they have a conversation. And Ribbentrop is like, oh, well, England's defeated, the British Empire is over, it's all ready to be carved up. And Molotov is sitting in there and he's like, well, if Britain is defeated, then why are we sitting in this air raid shelter? And why are all these bombs going off? Right? And so Molotov leaves this conversation. They have an agreement, but he's thinking that Germany has its hands full, and they do because he's thinking that they're not going to invade another front because how could they? They've got their hands busy, they're being bombed by England, right? They've got issues on the Western Front, so why would they open up another thing on the Eastern Front? Well, the thing about it is that Hitler's able to convince his generals and to send basically 3 million men into the USSR. And this takes Stalin off guard, counts him off guard, even though he had intelligence from spies that were in the German military telling him that the operation was going through, but he didn't believe it, didn't want to listen to it, whatever the case may be. And so what ends up happening is that the military is able to take, huge swaths of land. They're able to take, they get all the way to Kyiv, they get all the way to the gates of Moscow, they take parts of, Stalin, they're trying to get to Stalingrad, right? There's all these sort of things that are going on, and it looks like a huge success. All the while, along the way, it is literally a burn and pillage and destroy. They are not there to, take prisoners. They are slaughtering every single soldier, every single civilian, anybody along the way. And it's massive. It's absolutely massive and devastating. And this is one of the first parts during this area in 1941 when the German military people start taking pictures of their victims, people that they're about to massacre, lining people up, right? The Germans are very methodical in, keeping recordings of their dastardly doings, right? Because they think that this is a good idea. And so this is honestly used because it's sent back and people eventually get to see what is the true nature of these wars, especially people in Germany. They're like, well, wait a second, we didn't sign up for this. So this is when people start to question, what exactly is the rationale for this? Like, are we really just going to be slaughtering people left and right, innocent women and children, civilians that are just, being caught up in this war? So that's one of the best examples. But where the war starts to take a downturn is in 1942 with the Battle of Stalingrad. Rather than going to keep fighting towards in Moscow or, taking over Kiev, what ends up happening is that Hitler makes a call to move all of the military to Stalingrad, basically because the name itself, Stalin, right? He wanted to be able to capture that as an example to say like he's finished, right? Stalin is over, USSR is done, this is ours, right? Here's the problem. Much like Napoleon before him, he gets caught in the Russian winter and they are bogged down in Stalingrad, right? Russian winters are the death of all people. Why? Because most people don't know how to fight in not just in any winter, but a Russian winter, which is extremely difficult. And they don't have the equipment. They have to have supplies shipped in. They have to do all these things. And that takes men and money and resources from the other front that they're fighting on the other side with England. Remember, it's 1942. The Americans have already joined the war in 1941. So they're already pressing against that area because 2 years later, we're going to have D-Day, Normandy, Battle of the Bulge, and then eventually the capture of Berlin in 1945. Okay. So what you see here is that the loss that Hitler had was basically of his own doing. He doesn't realize, and when you are an authoritarian, often authoritarians go into these ideas of signs, or they believe in, destinies, or that it's just that they don't have to believe in intel or, experts, that they're like, no, I just go off of my gut. I believe that you can win if you just fight harder, right? Well, this is just not the case. Okay, so now let's take a look at the Asian theater. So 1931, you have Japan invades Manchuria, takes over this area. By 1939, they take 1937, excuse me, they have a full-on scale of, attack and taking over parts of China. 1942, they take over Singapore. They're expanding that area, but in 1941, they decide to bomb and attack the American military at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. This is what essentially gets the United States involved in World War II. At the time, it was very similar to World War I. They were doing the Lend-Lease program. They were going to stay out of the war, not really trying to get involved. However, as soon as 41 hits, you have that speech by President Roosevelt, a day which will live in infamy, right? And then that's how the United States gets involved in the war. Now, what's important to understand is that the reasons for getting involved, why exactly did Japan attack the United States and the fleet at Pearl Harbor? Well, it's pretty simple. In 1939, the United States puts an oil embargo on Japan. Basically, nobody can sell oil to them because the idea is that in order to stop their continual incursion into Asia, they need to have some sort of, oil resource. So if everybody stops selling them oil, then basically their military machine will grind to a halt. So in order to stop that embargo, the American military was what was stopping it. So let's go ahead and attack them so that we can basically get our oil and continue our war machine. But this is exactly what ends up happening because then the United States basically decides to participate in two theaters, one in the Pacific, one in Europe. What eventually happens in the Pacific theater is that it is basically a continuation of amphibious attacks where basically the United States and Japan are fighting over various islands in terms of control. The United States uses those islands to basically have air bases, money, men, supplies to basically use those to go and bomb the country of Japan and other military installations that the Japanese have set up, whether it's throughout the areas of Singapore or mainland China. Now, the fighting was total and all continuing. And so it wasn't until the decision with the Manhattan Project and the development of a nuclear weapon, an atomic bomb that could be used. The US decides to use this bomb on Hiroshima on August 6th and then later again in Nagasaki on August 9th. And this is the first time that you know, country, of course, it's the United States that used a atomic bomb on two major cities targets, which targeted not just military infrastructure, but also civilian infrastructure as well. And so, about a month later, September 2nd, Japan surrenders, and then World War II is officially over. Okay, so that's a lot. But what's interesting about this is that you need to understand how how all societies that were involved in this was an aspect of total war. And when we think of total war, what we're talking about is how every aspect of the economy, every aspect of the culture, every aspect of the government is put into winning this war, to the war effort. Germany was doing this in the 1930s. Japan was doing this in the 1930s. When the United States joins in 1941, it will begin to do this. No, we're not producing, cars. We're not producing, resources for the market. We are producing tanks. We're producing military grade weapons. We're building battleships. We're producing, Jeeps, right? Whatever military requirements are needed to win the war. All scrap, people go, all scrap is turned in for the metal. All, people build victory gardens. People, decide to go on rationing, whether that's sugar, that's meat, whatever the case may be. And so what's important to understand is that these total wars where the economy is involved in it, it has various impacts for various groups of people. In the United States, for instance, the wars are, create opportunities for women, create opportunities for African Americans, expand and change in terms of what people are able to do in terms of participation, demonstrating their contributions to society that would eventually lead in terms of the calls for more rights, more opportunities, whether that's in the women's rights movement, civil rights movement, etc. But there's also a human cost to this, right? Because this is a global conflict, the human loss is extreme. And it's not just because of things like the Holocaust, for instance, but we're talking about, somewhere between 70, 85 million people dead. I mean, most of the people, who died in this war were civilians, right? We're talking about somewhere in the range of over 50 million people, civilians that died as a result of this. It's not just the Holocaust, and the systematic genocide, and if you want to talk more about like the actual, specifics of how, the Holocaust was a structured, designed, and intentioned system to eradicate all Jews from Europe, take a look at, this link right here, which talks about the final solution, which was discussed at the Wannsee conference, where essentially the decision was made. This is how we're going to annihilate all Jews, which was going to be a system of gas chambers where, based off of the initial numbers and the testing that they had done at previous camps, that it was basically going to be about, on average, 2,500 people could be killed in an hour. 2,500. So if you think about that, like this is these intentions behind, the German leadership, the German government, the Nazi party, the intention was a systematic, calculated genocide to eradicate all Jews from Europe, right? And if you take a look at the Wannsee Conference, what it reveals is that the intentions are extremely clear. This isn't up for debate because we have the records that are left from this conference. We have the conversations, we have the letters, we have all the data here, and then we also have the results. We could see that they were putting it into implementation. But to be able to design a system of annihilation that allows you to kill 2,500 people an hour, right? On such a scale, shows how this war and the issues behind it, like this seems to be something that's far different, right? It's far different than just, casualties of war, the consequences of war, right? This seems something far beyond just war. This actually is something that many people didn't even actually understand. And that's the reason why that term, that genocide, develops as a result of this. But what is fascinating about the Holocaust is that, the Holocaust is really just a system of like links in a chain that you can see that this system of destruction that is evident in the Holocaust from the process of identification, ostracization, isolation, you know, to isolation, well, confiscation to isolation to annihilation, right? These five steps is the same thing that we can see time and time again with any sort of movement to remove a group of people, right? Whether that is African Americans in this country. We can see that process with all the way from the from slavery to the present. And we can see how the systems have created a process of identification, a way to identify who is a problem, a way that we can learn how to fear and hate these people, a process of isolating these people in terms of, areas of ghettos or putting them into prisons, confiscating their ability in which to use their own labor or to be able to vote or to be able to participate, and then finally to annihilate them. Whether that is in a formal process, whether it's like shootings by police officers, of unarmed black men, or whether it's just removing them from the population to where they gradually expire and are unable to procreate, right? There are very ways that we could do this, whether we do it with immigrants, black people, any group that any individual or group of people decide to identify as being a problem, those chains of destruction, those links in the chain, those five steps, you could ask yourself, which one are we in right now when it comes to which group, right? Because these things seem to happen as a part of their own process. But if you know how to identify them, then you can prevent certain things like the Holocaust from happening. Because remember, the Holocaust was perpetrated amongst a specific group of people. That doesn't mean that it can't happen again. Doesn't mean that another group of people couldn't necessarily do it, like what's happening in Israel at this moment. What they're doing to the Palestinians, what they're doing to the people in the Gaza Strip, what the Israelis are now doing to the people in Lebanon, right? It's not hard for you to be able to see that it's not necessarily, the group of people to which are receiving this treatment. It's the perpetrators who are doing it. Anybody can be a perpetrator. And that's the reason why you should be very critical when you hear somebody just say, like, well, we can't be a perpetrator because of how we were treated in the past. No, that's not how this works. Anybody can discriminate. And that's one of the things that World War II has taught us, is that after this period, anybody can be a perpetrator and anybody can be a victim, right? It just depends on which side that you ultimately want to be on. But as a consequence of World War II, it's not just the loss, but it's also the rise of the superpowers that we will see in terms of the development of two different ideologies between capitalist democracies and communist, ideologies and dictatorships, right, that are vying for control that we'll see in the post-war period of the Cold War. Or it's the development of the UN in terms of creating a body where all people can come equally to discuss and try to maintain peace and stability on the world to avoid massive conflicts where over 80 million people are killed. Okay? So if you have any questions or anything like that, feel free to reach out to me via text.